1957, a former student named Jerry came through town, and he came by to look at my baby and say hello. And when he heard I was running the Student Peace Center, that I was its president, he said, "Oh, you're a student leader. You know, you should come to the Moscow Youth Festival for Peace and Freedom, international meeting, and it's going to be in Moscow for 2 weeks." Well, that was amazing. And before you knew it, I was on my way to Moscow for 2 weeks to be a delegate to the International Festival, Youth Festival for Peace and Freedom. There were probably about 240 or 50 Americans, and I probably met most or some of them. But more importantly, I met the people of the world, the youth of the world. And for the first time in my life, I met someone from Vietnam, a beautiful, very delicate and petite woman in beautiful silken embroidered clothes with long hair, with a beautiful voice, who I spoke with through a translator, and she told about her life and movement, and I told about mine. And I was very, very impressed with that. I didn't even know where Vietnam was, and I think it was called Indochina, is how she was presented to me. And then, because of my affinity for Spanish, I would sometimes eat with the Latin American delegation. There were only a few of them, like maybe 18 or 16. And I don't remember them one by one, but through my reading of history, I found out that many of the leaders of the progressive movements in Latin America were on that delegation, including someone who would later be my friend, Roque Dalton from El Salvador, and Carlos Fonseca Amador, the founder of the Sandinista movement in Nicaragua. But at that moment, they were just young guys, full of song, full of jokes, very flirty and fun to hang out with. Whereas the American delegation wasn't so much fun to hang out with because they tended to have all these political arguments. And it seemed to me this was the moment for getting beyond political arguments and making real people contacts and learning what other people in the world were like. And I can say that the food was fantastic. Every morning I would have sour cream and black caviar for breakfast, and there'd be bowls of it there at lunch and dinner. So I think I mostly ate that all the time, and delicious, thick breads. And it was a festival full of song, and there was even a festival song that we sang in all the different languages, and I found that so moving. And it was a moment when it seemed like the world might just explode, maybe like this moment where it feels like the planet will be starved out of clean water and clean air. And then it was the fear that because the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb and the US had the atomic bomb, and they were such enemies, dedicated enemies, that the world would explode through these atomic and hydrogen bombs. So it meant a lot to hear a song sung in so many different languages, and to be meeting people from all over the world who felt like I did, who believed in peace, who believed in freedom, and were willing to take some risks for it. At the end of the 2 weeks, somebody came over to our dormitory and invited us to go to China, saying that if we wanted to take a look at the Chinese Revolution, which had just happened in 1949, and this was 1957, so relatively sooner. It was a more recent revolution, where the Russian Revolution had happened in 1917, so that it was far from its revolutionary roots, where China was developing its revolution. And they invited us. They would take us by train through China, and then we could pick up our flights back from whatever tickets we had. Well, before we ever got to the train ride, and while the invitation was being made, we were also visited by the US State Department, who declared that this was a terrible, terrible thing, that it was forbidden to go to China. And I was very outraged to think that I didn't have the right to travel, that I had a passport, a US passport, which was such a valued object in the world, and yet there were places that I was not allowed to go with it. This outraged me. And also, they threatened us of what might happen to us if we were to break that travel ban. And the travel ban to the Soviet Union that year had only been lifted the year before. It had actually been illegal for Americans to go visit the Soviet Union. So even visiting the Soviet Union when we did in '57, just a year after the lifting of the ban, it was still a very not approved of thing. And so only 42 of us took up the Chinese invitation, and off we went. To go to China, we boarded the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Oh, just the name of that filled me with excitement, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So many murder mysteries and adventure stories of the era, or the earlier era, had taken place on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And it was quite an experience. It was a 10-day journey from Moscow to Peking. Tea was served on the train, and it was the festival train. So car by car was filled with the youth of different countries. And you can imagine, as a young person, the fun of running down those corridors and meeting people from other youth from different countries in the different cars. And I would run down to the Latin American car and hang out with those guys. And they would come, the porters on the train would come and serve us chai, which was tea. We passed Siberia. I looked out the window and I was in Siberia, but actually I was just in a thin cotton, an Indian print wraparound skirt and a new fabric that had just come out called Drip Dry, Daycon. You didn't have to wash it, but it looked like cotton. So this little thin blouse and a Orlan sweater, another new fabric that you just had to rinse out. And I was not cold, because I had always thought Siberia was the kind of place where you would freeze to death. But of course it was autumn, so it wasn't that cold. And when we'd look out the window, we'd see log cabins, and it looked kind of like the Western frontier. And then wonderful people would greet us with flowers at all the stops and sing us songs and hand us sausages and breads through the window to keep us going. One thing I did in China was to hook up with one of the translators, who turned out to be a young woman from Greenwich Village in New York. So she was totally saturated in the arts, and I told her that my main interest was theater. Well, she loved theater. So she arranged that sometimes when the whole delegation was maybe going to look at a mine or look at a factory or a construction site, we were going off to the theater. And to theater training schools in every province that we visited, in every town, and she was by my side translating. So I saw a lot of the training of actors, and it was awesome. It was beyond anything I'd ever imagined as a student of the Stanislavski method, which is kind of realism theater, to see the kinds of theatricality that I saw in China just blew me away, and to see what was demanded of the Chinese actor. The Chinese actor was an acrobat, a singer, a person able to do things larger than life and not at all bound by realism. And at the same time, in many of these operas, they had incorporated the new ideology, the socialist ideology, so they would incorporate stories that would prove the point about maybe class struggle or about working together cooperatively. So they would weave in the ideology, but still in the format of the old traditions, and how highly skilled their performers were. That really amazed me, the dedication and the skill and achievement of the Chinese artists. Meeting Chou En-Lai was arranged by whoever was facilitating our trip, and so it was just one of the many formal meetings. They would take us. Fortunately, we were youth, so there was no rest on this 2-month journey. We were constantly visiting factories, schools, prisons, theaters, childcare centers, seeing construction sites. We were always seeing how the country was developing. And so on one of those assigned trips, we arrived somewhere and there was a ceremony going on, and Chou En-Lai was there, and right away there was something special about him that I remember to this day. That was 1957. His composure, his quiet confidence, and his friendly aura, and he smiled at me and said in English, perfect English, hello. Where are you from? And that kind of encounter, very limited, but very memorable because of his warmth and intelligence.